Thank you again for having me. It's really nice to get out of the cave that I've been hiding myself away in as I prepare to submit my KO1 next month. So I'm going to be talking today about social responsibility and the weaponization of genomic research. And before I begin any talk, I like to take a moment to share my motivations for doing the research that I do. And I do this because, as Dr. Leonard already mentioned in a viewpoint that I published in 2021, genes do not operate in a vacuum, and neither should our research. Each of us do work. The work that we do is informed by our lived experiences, informed by our values. And so one of the things that motivates me in the work that I do is my desire to want to identify, examine, and disrupt social narratives that we tell about genes that have been used to harm our understandings of ourselves and our understandings of others. My own personal experiences as a recipient of narratives like this motivate the work that I do, but so do the observations that I have had over the course of my scholarship, including during my PhD when I was fortunate to get to work with some youth. And so today I want to share a mind map that was created by one of the 5th grade students that I had the privilege of working with one day during my PhD. I was volunteering in the classroom of a teacher who was participating in my research. And that day, students in the class were asked to summarize a reading that they had done on Katherine Johnson, who, if you saw the film Hidden Figures, was an African-American woman who helped to calculate the first trajectory of a person going into space. This was a school that was in the Chicago metropolitan area, public charter school. Over 90% of students were on free reduced price meals. Over 95% of students in the school identified as Black or African American. And you may have already noticed what I'm going to point out here, but there was a particular element of the students' mind map that stood out to me. One of the key messages that they had taken away from Katherine Johnson's story was the following: just because you are Black, you can be smart. This is just a turn of a phrase, but it signifies a level of understanding from this 5th grade girl, African-American girl, that Black people are not considered by society to be smart. Katherine Johnson, in the eye of the student, was a deviation from the norm. So this is an example of the kind of social narrative that I am committed in my work to trying to disrupt. So I'm really interested in genomic research in particular. Genes capture the popular imagination. They are sources of promise and peril. They are objects of fear and fascination. We tend, as members of the public, not to process information about genetic attributions in an even-handed or rational way. We often think of genes being fixed, as dividing people into homogeneous and discrete groups, as being immutable. And within human genomic research, I've been particularly interested in social and behavioral genomics. This is the study of whether and how and why genetic differences between beings are differences in behaviors and socioeconomic outcomes. Research study an array of outcomes and characteristics, including education-related behaviors and outcomes, same-sex sexual behavior, political orientation, aggressive and criminal behaviors. And understandably, research in this area is deeply controversial. It is deeply polarizing. There are many active debates within the academic community about whether and how this research should be conducted. Part of the reason why social behavioral genomics research is so controversial is because claims regarding biological or genetic difference in human behavior have been used for nefarious purposes. There is a long, ugly history, and I want to walk through just 2 historical examples to illustrate how this history impacts the work that we do today. So the first is to tell the story of this man. This is Georges Louis Leclerc, Comte de, quite a name. He was a French naturalist. He was born into the French aristocracy, and he was educated in law and in medicine. He was fascinated by the natural world, but he was also unsatisfied with existing explanations for the diversity of life around him. And he was, for instance, one of the first people to argue that the Earth was older than Genesis, which of course received the condemnation of the Catholic Church. 100 years, though, before Charles Darwin published On the Origins of Species and developed the theory of natural selection, Comte de Buffon wrote The Varieties of the Human Species, and in it he used the word race to describe different human populations. He was one of the first to use the term race to describe different human populations. Previously, this term had been used in zoology to describe differences between animal species. So in his 1749 work and ones that followed, he argued that physical and cultural differences between groups of humans was caused by diverse climate environments, and that white Europeans represented the original race and other races were degeneration of it. What Buffon helped to launch was the application of race to human populations and a sweeping academic enterprise known as race science. Race science was, and it remains, an enterprise committed to measuring and assigning different behavioral characteristics, different racial groups. And the area of inquiry drew individuals from fields like physical anthropology, biological anthropology, and phrenology. Claiming science as an ally, eminent thinkers in the 18th and 19th centuries widely argued that there was ample evidence demonstrating that racial groups represented separate biological species. And it became commonly accepted that racial groups make up a sort of natural hierarchical order upon which white Europeans stand at the top. So taking this historical context, let's now fast forward about 2 centuries later, look at how the kinds of biological conceptualizations of race that were started during this era played out. People may already know the story of Mildred and Richard Loving, but perhaps I can provide some additional context to that today. So Mildred Dolores Peter, she was a shy, soft-spoken woman. Her family and friends affectionately called her String Bean. And it was through her older brothers that she met Richard Perry Loving, who was a local drag racing day laborer who was 6 years senior. The couple married in Washington, D.C. in 1958, and soon after they returned to their hometown of Central Point, Virginia, which happened to be my home state. Central Point is not far from where I grew up, from where my parents still live today. A month after their wedding, the Lovings were startled awake in the middle of the night by police officers who burst into their home. They were arrested and they were taken to a jail in nearby Bowling Green, where their marriage was declared illegal. Soon after, a county judge sentenced them each to a year in prison. And rather than spend time incarcerated, they each decided to pay court fees, which came out to about $50 in today's present day dollars, leave the state of Virginia and not return for 25 years. So their marriage was declared illegal because Richard was white and Mildred was not. They were an interracial couple. When the judge in the local county jail issued his ruling, his final sentencing, he said, "Almighty God created the races, white, black, yellow, Malay, and red, and he placed them on separate continents. And but for the interference with his arrangement, there would be no cause for such marriages. The fact that he separated the races shows he did not intend for the races to mix." Of course, the Lovings were born and raised in the state of Virginia. They wanted to return to their home state, and so they fought to have their marriage legally recognized. This battle took them all the way to the Supreme Court, as I'm sure many people here know. And in the 1967 Supreme Court case, Loving versus Virginia, the critical moment was the following line of question between one of the Supreme Court justices, Hugo L. Black, who was actually a former member of the KKK, and the defense, Robert McIlwain. So Black started off by asking the defense, is not the basic premise of these anti-miscegnation laws or laws outlawing interracial marriage that white people are superior to the colored people and that they should therefore not be permitted to marry because it might pollute the white race? McIlwain was reluctantly forced, you can sense this reluctance if you listen to the audio recording from the court proceedings, that, in your honor, I think historically that the legislatures that enacted them had that thought in mind. So his reluctant admission to the underlying motivation behind the Virginia laws outlawing interracial marriage was a key reason why the Supreme Court decided to unanimously strike down such laws to deem them illegal. The justices concluded that these laws did not view members of different racial groups as fundamentally equal to one another. It regarded white individuals as superior to other racial groups. And because of that, this was a violation of the 14th Amendment. So this is part one of our brief history lesson. Let's go to part two. This is Francis Galton. He is Charles Darwin's half-cousin. Siddhartha Mukherjee, we are proud to have as an undergrad of Stanford, wrote a little bit about Francis Galton in his book, The Gene, describing him as a man of many trades, unsuccessful medical student. He was a mathematician, a world explorer, but he was also a pioneer in the study of human intelligence and the father of eugenics and behavior genetics. Galton helped to develop the conceptualization of intelligence as a genetically influenced and unchanging fixed trait. And he was particularly concerned with the decline of genius in society. So he put emphasis on trying to encourage those that he believed to be physically and mentally superior members of society choose partners with similar traits. Let's take a look now at how Galton's conceptualizations of intelligence, his concerns about the decline of intelligence in society played out roughly half a century later. This is Carrie and Emma Buck. Again, a perhaps unfortunate shout out to my state of Virginia. Carrie was admitted to the Virginia State Colony, a mental institution designed to separate so-called feeble-minded individuals from the rest of society in 1924. Her mother was already there by the time Carrie arrived. And Virginia was one of the first states to pass legislation permitting involuntary sterilization of individuals designated as feeble-minded. Proponents of such measures believed that they were necessary to promote the welfare of society, and they feared that feeble-minded individuals would pass down their alleged low intelligence, their overactive sex drives, and their moral degeneracy to future generations. And so the state of Virginia, arguing that Carrie was a genetic threat to society, filed to sterilize her under this new Virginia law. But whether or not this law was going to be permissible in the eyes of the US Constitution was uncertain. And so Carrie's case ended up in the judicial system, eventually making its way to the Supreme Court. In 1927, the Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell deemed forced sterilization for eugenic purposes legal in the United States. It passed 8-1. And as the final ruling was issued, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for the imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." By 1935, all but 6 states in the United States had introduced legislation permitting involuntary sterilization, and over the course of the 20th century, 33 states had compulsory sterilization programs, sterilizing over 70,000 women without consent. Technically, Buck v. Bell has never been overturned. So I know it's probably a little unusual to have a bit of a history lesson in pediatrics grand rounds, but I provide this to give context for where we are today in 2023. We're still trying to understand and ameliorate injustice in genomics, and we need continuing vigilance to move genomic science and medicine forward without breathing new life into mythologies about inherent racial inequality. And these really are impacts that are still felt today. Lives such as that of Catherine Cat Macy, who was president and founder of the Cherry Street Walk Club, who was passionate about bettering her community, who was considered creative and always willing to go the extra mile for others, and who was one of the 10 African Americans killed by the Buffalo shooter in May of 2022. The Buffalo shooter was a white teenager who used myths about genes to justify his racist crusade. Specifically, he articulated the view that there are biological differences between racial groups and that these differences make whites superior, including specifically, he called out an intelligence. And as supporting evidence for these views, the shooter referenced in his over 100-page manifesto a series of recent mainstream genomic studies. Coming off of this, along with colleagues, I wrote an opinion piece in Scientific American calling on the scientific research community to begin taking more seriously the risk of race misappropriation of research, and to join others such as Resnick and Elliott in calling for social responsibility, taking seriously our social responsibilities as members of the scientific community. So researchers have obligations to address the societal implications of their work in an ethically responsible manner. This includes our obligation to do no harm, to help others, to obligation to society, because we have benefited, whether directly or indirectly, from government support of our education and our research. We have the obligation also to help the public address the implications of the research that we do. All of these various obligations come together to form our social responsibility. Of course, social responsibility can be a bit of a nebulous concept. It can be difficult to exercise, to know what to do. And the role of social responsibilities in the ethical conduct and translation of scientific research are poorly understood. There are limited examples in the literature of efforts to try and understand social responsibility. This is one such example. AAAS conducted a survey in 2021 of scientists and engineers to try and understand that their views of their social responsibilities. They found that researchers view themselves as having social responsibilities, but their beliefs about their social responsibilities do not translate into behaviors or actions. So there are a number of dilemmas here when it comes to thinking through social responsibility, and I'm going to go through three key ones. One are dilemmas related to problem selection, so deciding what proposed research is worthwhile to do, what research is worthwhile to fund, to report on. Another are dilemmas related to publication and data sharing, so deciding whether to publish a study, where to publish that study, how to publish it. And finally, dilemmas related to engaging society, so deciding whether and how to engage the public. I'm going to go through, within the context of social and behavioral genomics, some examples of how these dilemmas play out. So the first one is public problem selection. As I already mentioned, social behavioral genomics is deeply controversial. There are people, all of us, when we do our research, we conduct risk-benefit analyses to help guide us in the research decisions that we make. And in social and behavioral genomics, there's a lot of debate over the risks and benefits of this research. There are people who feel that the benefits outweigh the risks, and there are people who feel that the risks outweigh the benefits. So for some who believe that the benefits of this research outweigh the risks, part of the justifications that they provide for doing the research that they do is the following. One is controlling for genetic studies in social science could allow for more rigorous research by allowing us to control for a potential confounding variable. Polygenic scores for behavioral phenotypes could enhance prediction of clinical phenotypes such as type 2 diabetes, ischemic heart disease. Another reason why people do this research is they say that it could improve our understandings of the effects of environments, including parenting, policies, or interventions that might lead to or entrench inequality. So it might help us better understand the origins and causes of social inequalities. People also argue that this research could allow us to tailor interventions to an individual and abandon one-size-fits-all approaches, and that it could reduce blame that we place on individuals for their circumstances because their genetics are out of their control. But there are, of course, others who feel that the risks of this research outweigh benefits. And so arguments that they provide include that social and behavioral genomics research could distract from the kinds of research that might be more important for addressing social inequalities, that we fall into this trap of datafying everything. We focus on pathologizing trauma and inequality instead of going to try and address the causes of that trauma and inequality. That such research could exacerbate harmful social narratives about genes and behavior, that it could allow society to absolve itself of responsibility for action, again, by focusing on pathologizing trauma and inequality to locate blame specifically within the individual instead of within society. And that it could be weaponized, as the Buffalo shooting illustrates, to legitimize racist, classist, ableist, sexist acts that can result in loss of human life. Second dilemma I want to go through briefly here is dilemmas related to publication and data sharing. So again, this is a question of what to publish, where to publish, how to publish. Industry have really taken to social behavioral genomic data. There is a very booming direct-to-consumer genetic testing market. People can very easily access direct-to-consumer genetic tests for things like math ability. At one point, this same company offered one for same-sex sexual behavior, sexual orientation. They have since taken it down, in part due to outcry from the public about it. But for relatively small amounts of money, at least if you're in the United States context, these tests are readily available to you. There are also dating companies that purport to help administer compatible matches using individuals' DNA. And of course, there's the growing field of polygenic embryo selection, allowing prospective parents to select embryos using information as it relates to complex behaviors and traits. This particular company, LifeView, when it was launched, included in its selection of tests the ability for parents to deselect against embryos with low polygenic scores for cognitive ability and low polygenic scores for height. And then, of course, there is the weaponization of genetic genomic research by members of the alt-right. So this was an article that was published in the New York Times in 2018. It describes a study that was conducted by researchers in 2018 on the genetic etiology of lactase persistence, or a person's ability to digest lactose. Researchers identified specific genetic variants that enable digestion of lactose, and they wrote that these variants are found to be most common in European and East African genetic ancestries, which enabled a genetic mutation that proved advantageous, that one was able to digest lactose after childhood. Members of the alt-right in the United States latched onto this study as yet another example of their white supremacy. They began holding milk chugging contests to prove their superior ability to digest milk. And so this is just an illustration of how a topic as seemingly neutral as one's ability to digest lactase became weaponized by white supremacy. One individual in particular who followed on from this study, who used this study to argue for his white superior position within society, was the Buffalo shooter. Discord is a chat app that's popular with members of the far right, and in one of his Discord logs from February, that I can drink all the dairy products I want and not suffer any consequences or move brown. One of the particular studies that I want to talk about today that was cited in the shooter's manifesto was a 2018 genome mitigation study on educational attainment. This study identified several hundred variants that are statistically significant associations with educational attainment in a sample of over 1 million people of European genetic ancestries. The study sought to identify alleles that were linked not with intelligence per se, but with educational attainment, which is the number of years of schooling a person completes in their lifetime. And although the team identified, as I said, several hundred variants that had statistically significant associations with educational attainment, several hundred of those within that sample were associated with performance on cognitive and academic tests. And so from these alleles, this study was able to account for between 11 and 13% of the variation observed in genetic attainment, and between 7 and 10% of the variation in cognitive performance. So this study was published in 2018. The Buffalo shooter cited a table that riffed off of this study within his manifesto. It included a pseudo-scholarly table showing that these variants that were identified in the 2018 GWAS were more common in Europeans than Africans. This is a really large table and it's a little blurry, so this is just a snapshot of what a section of that image, that figure looks like. So the shooter listed a specific SNP and then describe the distribution. So for example, in that top row, the SNP list as the shooter lists as having Europeans are 4,192% more likely to have allele than Africans. I want to really credit Jed Carlson, my colleague Jed Carlson, for doing deep dive into trying to understand how the original 2018 GWAS morphed into this table and became a scientific meme for members of the alt-right. So let's take a look at some of his work tracing the origins of the EA table. So less than 6 weeks after EA3 was published in 2018, the following thread was posted to 4chan. 4chan is an internet message board where users can post anonymously, and it's a popular message forum for members of the far right. This user cross-referenced alleles that were identified in that 2018 Nature Genetics study with a publicly accessible catalog of genomic data called the 1,000 Genomes Project. The 1,000 Genomes Project is a database comprised of samples from approximately 26 ancestral populations from around the world. If you can't read exactly what it says on the slide, one of the things is that stands out is they start by saying, I found groundbreaking genetic evidence for racial differences. I can't do anything about it. If someone here is a scientist, go run the numbers and get it published at the risk of ruining your career, but saving humanity. Approximately, roughly about 2 hours after this original post, the user created and shared a table that purported to show approximately 15 genetic variants that were, quote, known to increase intelligence, and that according to the 1,000 Genomes Project were more common in European ancestry groups than in African ancestry groups. The user wrote, quote, this data is pretty damning when you check the effect sizes. I don't have time to do more than this. I only checked one of the tables in the study, but there's easily over 200 genes like this. Over the following 5 days, this table morphed into several iterations until resulting in that final table that you can see in the far right, which is the one that the Buffalo shooter ultimately included in his manifesto. So posting frequencies of studies of scientific memes, such as the table that the Buffalo shooter used in his manifesto, increased following shootings and political events. So the Buffalo shooter is just one data point in a larger trend that's demonstrating how scientific research is weaponized, is used by members of extreme political communities. And the weaponization of genetic genomic research, it raises questions about how we should publish our studies, where we should publish our studies, and the final dilemma, which I'm going to talk to now, which is the practice of engaging society. So social and behavioral genomics, as I will say till the cow comes home, is a controversial area of research. And I interviewed several genomics researchers in this field, trying to understand their motivations for doing this research, what they viewed their social responsibilities as being. One thing that stood out in particular was that the researchers whose accounts I included in this paper who were interviewed seemed most interested in this final particular dilemma of social responsibility, whether and how to engage the public. One of the people that I interviewed, and I won't read the whole quote, but he was involved in a genomic study on educational attainment and recognized that the study was dealing with extremely sensitive material. He says that they decided to take a proactive approach. They recognize that journalists often want breathtaking headlines or sensational headlines. And so they spent a lot of time talking to journalists, trying to convince them that they shouldn't write such a sensationalist paper. And they thought usually to be a success if after talking with the journalist decided not to write a publication, a piece on their study. So social and behavioral genomics researchers, recognizing the controversial nature of their work, the social risks of their work, one strategy that they've taken to trying to mitigate the miscommunication or misinterpretation of their work are these FAQ documents, explanatory documents that are designed to temper claims about the research, to identify and proactively stem potential misinterpretations. It asks basic questions and answers basic questions like who conducted the study, what is the group's overarching goals, what was already known about the genetics of risk tolerance prior to this study. This practice of developing FAQs was started by this group, the Social Science Genetic Association Consortium. It's an interdisciplinary cohort of medical, social science, and ethics researchers. They published the first FAQ accompanying a genomic study on human behavior in 2013. This was an FAQ accompanying the first Genomic Association study on educational attainment. So there have been 4 iterations of genome-wide association studies on educational attainment. The first one came out in 2013, and it was produced by this Social Science Genetic Association Consortium and spearheaded by Michelle Meyer, who's a bioethicist, and Dan Benjamin, who's a social science behavior genomics researcher. Along with colleagues, I was able to create a database of these documents, and we were able to assess the growth of these FAQ publications over time. The first one was launched in 2013, and we've seen others in the field begin to adopt this approach. The issue, though, with these FAQs is that they are pretty difficult to find. They were posted on consortia websites. Some researchers posted them on their personal blogs. They weren't easily accessible, even though they were working to be accessible. So these are often documents that are over 20 pages long. They still include a lot of technical language. And so alongside colleagues, we decided to take these FAQ documents and build a repository that was graciously hosted by the Hastings Center. This is the Bioethics Institute based out of Garrison, New York. We compile all FAQs that have been published on human genetic genomic studies regarding human behavior in this repository. And we worked to try and make this repository more accessible to journalists, to members of the public. This included the Hastings Center hosting a session for journalists, specifically on social and behavioral genomics, and some of the challenges of reporting on this research. This is an example of one of the entries in the repository. So we tried to summarize each FAQ so that people could get a snapshot into what the document covered, what some of the key findings were, how they could contact one of the study authors to ask further questions. This example, however, if we think about the scientific method, the scientific process is happening during the reporting of conclusions, right? So these FAQ documents, they come out once the study has already been conducted, already been published. It is at the tail end of the scientific method. And so I want to talk about one example of an initiative that is focused on getting a little bit earlier on in that scientific process. This is a grant-funded working group that I'm a part of that includes an interdisciplinary cohort of academic researchers titled Wrestling with Social and Behavioral Genomics. We disagree about the potential risks and benefits of social and behavioral genomics, but we're driven by two aims, and we're in the final stages of this project right now. The first aim is to ask ourselves what are ethically acceptable and unacceptable areas of social and behavioral genomic research. And the second is to identify strategies for the responsible conduct and communication of such research. I'm going to talk today about one particular component of this project, which was a subcommittee I spearheaded to build out a community sounding board comprised of members of the public. These are my colleagues within the academic research community who were a part of this effort to recruit and put together this sounding board group. And we ultimately ended up with an 11-member group of paid volunteers. We specifically sought to recruit individuals who identified with communities that have historically been exploited by scientific research. So this racialized minorities, low income, low education individuals. We also wanted people who represented an array of religions and political orientations, and we were mostly successful. So we had members who had not completed high school. We had members from different stages of the lifespan, from age 18 to 65. We had members with different spiritual and religious identities, including Mormon, Muslim, Catholic, and atheist. We had students, a retired police officer, someone who stocks shelves and pushes carts at Target, a mental health therapist. We were not, however, successful at getting different political orientations. We did have people who identified as liberal, moderate, and conservative, but the sounding board was majority comprised of community members who identified as progressive. And this was despite our direct focus on wanting to include more conservative members. And there's a whole other conversation that occur on that. So topics that we covered with the sounding board included what makes you excited about this area of research, what makes you nervous about it. Are there topics, specific topics of study that make you more or less uncomfortable? So what are they? What are reasons for and against doing such research? How might researchers improve their strategies for communicating with the public about this? And part of our motivation for wanting to form a sounding board is because the task of defining the harms and benefits of research is traditionally left to researchers, to professional societies, regulatory bodies. We have a relatively narrow set of individuals and stakeholder groups that we get give the privilege of defining the harms and benefits of research. And so we wanted to know how community members, particularly those who have historically been exploited by scientific research, defined harms and benefits of social and behavioral genomics once they learned about it. So I just want to briefly go through some of the potential benefits and potential harms that we heard from community members about social and behavioral genomics. One potential benefit that people mentioned was the benefit of scientific discovery. One of our members said, science is about constantly learning things. It's about learning facts. Science is about learning new things. We'll have answers as we do more research. Another potential benefit that was identified by community members was understanding human difference. So one of our members said, I want to know if there's things that have happened because of genetics. My father dropped out of school in the 9th grade. I dropped out of college, and my oldest daughter dropped out of high school. And so, is that a part of our genes? Is that in our genetics? Community members also identified risks to this research. So one that came up was the potential use by law enforcement of this data. One of our members said, I and many people from the African immigrant community, we just, like other people of color in this community, we sometimes get worried about how research data is used by law enforcement to stereotype the whole population. And another risk that community members were concerned about, potential to exacerbate inequality through this research. So one of our members said, coming from a Native population, and a lot of researchers research, there are basically middle-aged white men, because they have access to all of the resources in the world. They are the first ones to be researched, and assumptions are made, and it leaves out smaller groups like mine. And they worry that this would just continue in this emerging area. And finally, one sounding board, I think, had a really astute reflection. He said, I think it is human nature to see the good in everything, though often on a subconscious level. We look at situations, products, financial offers, and a million other things and think to ourselves how to immediately better our lives. What is difficult, and usually through hindsight, are the potential downsides to these same things. Unintended negative consequences can then often occur. One of the reasons why I think this is such an astute observation is because the existing mechanisms that we have within research for regulating the ethical conduct of the work that we do are limited in their ability to appraise downstream implications, and especially the potential social harms. So as I mentioned before, research defining of harms and benefits is often identified by researchers, by the institutional bodies and regulatory bodies that help to govern the work that we do. Things like the Common Rule, things like research ethics committees, and institutional review boards. IRBs, however, are expressly prohibited by the Common Rule from considering any broad social or policy risks. They are encouraged to focus on direct risks to research participants. IRBs generally don't regulate risks other than those directly encountered, as I mentioned. Per the Common Rule, however, IRBs are allowed to judge the broader social benefits of research. So they are allowed to judge whether research has the potential to enhance health or knowledge. But one of the key takeaways from this, however, is that even though IRBs are allowed to a very limited extent consider the social benefits, there are virtually no incentives to consider the downstream implications, and especially the social implications, social harms of scientific research. So key takeaways here, because I've kind of done a whirlwind tour of behavioral genomics, of the risks and benefits of it, of this concept of social responsibility and the dilemmas around exercising our social responsibilities. There are few incentives and policies that exist for us to consider the role of social responsibility in the ethical conduct and translation of research. Social responsibilities are also difficult to define and exercise, but we all have them. Importantly, researchers are not the only ones with social responsibilities or the only ones who should be thinking about how to exercise them. So we have others within the research enterprise, other stakeholder groups who also have responsibilities to think about the ethical conduct of research. Funders are just one example. And so as we think about our social responsibilities, one potential option that has been used by researchers in social and behavioral genomics are these use of FAQs, or trying to create other accessible materials to aid journalists reporting on studies. I think that this is a tool that carries out beyond social and behavioral genomics. So even though none of us in this room might be doing social and behavioral genomic research, there are still value in considering trying to communicate with the public using accessible materials like FAQ documents. Key takeaways regarding downstream implications. There are a few incentives and policies for us to consider the downstream implications. As I already mentioned, the regulatory bodies that we are beholden to are prohibited from considering these social harms in particular, but a lesser extent also the social benefits. The downstream implications of research can be difficult to identify. I acknowledge that, but throwing our hands up will stymie efforts to mitigate potential harms and promote potential benefits. It will be too late by the time we realize we need to do something about it. One strategy that the sounding board effort that I described worked to take was to broaden who is included in conversations about the risks and benefits of research early in the process. So again, recognizing who it is that we currently allow to be in conversations about the risks and benefits of the work that we do, and taking an approach of trying to be more expansive in who we include in conversations. So as I mentioned, scientists are not the only relevant stakeholder group. As I showed with the example of the sounding board, we sought in particular individuals who represent and identify with communities that have historically been exploited by. One of the messages that I think is important to convey here is when conceptualizing your research, it's important, although there are few incentives for us to do so, to consider the downstream implications, the social harms and benefits, in addition to the direct risk participants. So this is an acknowledgement that although the system might encourage us just to think about the direct risk to our research participants, there are broader implications to the work that we do, and there are social responsibilities to think what those broader implications are when we do our risk-benefit analyses. I have got 10 minutes for questions, so I want to just give some special thanks to Dr. Leonard, to Dr. Magnus and Cho, who are at the Center for Biomedical Ethics, to my colleagues who are part of the Wrestling with Social and Behavioral Genomics Working Group, and our community members. And thank you so much for having me here today. I'm looking forward to the question and answer section.
Great talk, Daphne. So the question is sort of I'll give you the question, then give you an example. So it's not just a North American or even European, but it's a whole international problem. So the question is, how do you deal with the tsunami of what's coming in terms of not just the e-world, but open access? So an example, I got a paper yesterday from China. They editorially rejected it, but it was basically using a polygenic risk score from 50 clock genes, and they wanted to predict adolescents' health risk behaviors and their mental health. And the proposal from these researchers is that pediatricians could then take this and screen children. So there's this self-fulfilling prophecy. So I guess the horse is out of the barn. You got a lot of time to keep doing this research, but how do you tackle this? There's a tsunami out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really on the mark question to ask. It's really interesting because, when I was interviewing social and behavioral genomics researchers, and I wasn't just interviewing ones who were in the US context, so there were some who were in Europe, and a lot of the work on educational attainment has been concentrated in the US and Europe, but that's not to say it's not happening elsewhere. One of the things that was a common response from them is, well, you would rather that me, someone who's talking to you, an ethicist, very aware of the dark history behind this work, you'd rather that I do this work rather than others who aren't aware of this context, who may have more nefarious intentions in the work that they do. And so the one thing that I'll say, and I think this speaks to the work that I've been doing in adversarial collaboration, is to try and have these very serious conversations with people that we may fundamentally disagree with, to try and understand their motivations for doing the work that they do, as much as I want them to understand my motivations for the work that I do, and for us also to have conversations to understand the nature of our disagreement. I understand, however, that, given the world that we live in, it is very unlikely that this research is going to stop at any point. And so another question that I sometimes get is asking whether by focusing on social and behavioral genomics, I give it too much purchase. And my response to that is, we have tried for a very long time to argue against research in this space, and that has not been successful. And so another reason for, I think, this adversarial collaborative approach is to try and build a bridge between these respective research communities who have become increasingly entrenched in their respective camps about whether or not to do this research.
Yeah,
So
no, and just the only, I mean, because I don't think the intent of these Chinese researchers was nefarious, but they're going to get it published regardless. They'll get it published in some crap journal, and that's the problem. I think it's your last bullet really hits it on the mark. I don't think in the international community people are going to. I don't know the way to get people to consider the social implications of their research. I mean, I applaud what you're doing, but it's going that's getting very hard because of the proliferation of publish anything.
No, I agree. It's difficult. I guess, just to reiterate the point, I think that there's a lot of power in members of a research community calling out other members of that research community in the work that they do. And so I think that, that's one small step towards trying to do that.
Yeah, I think the other thing is you referred to crap journals. Even worse are what we call the predatory journals, where you can pay to publish your paper that don't get peer review, but look online like they do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, that was a great presentation. I just had a question though. I understand that in the real sense, most researchers aren't looking at social responsibilities and what the long downstream effects of what they're publishing is. But when we say that, like your last point mentioned, broadening the scope of people who will see the research earlier in the research process, for example, it's in marginalized communities, who would that audience be that may assess the research before it's published to give them some insight on what the long stream, downstream effects could possibly be? Like what would be an example of a party that would assess that research ahead of time?
So like, for example, in the sounding board initiative that I presented on, we specifically wanted to recruit for individuals who were coming from racialized minority communities, who were low income, who were low education, in part because they represented communities that historically had been exploited by scientific research, and also represented or had affinities with demographic characteristics that are now of interest to social and behavioral genomics researchers. So, another example, which I didn't talk about, and which there is debate about the level of appropriateness of that work, was the genome-wide association study that was done on same-sex sexual orientation. Members of the study team for that genome-wide association study themselves identified with the LGBTQ+IA community, and they held focus groups and conversations with members of the public who represented the LGBTQ+IA community. So that's just another example of people trying to include members of the public who may represent the phenotype, the trait, the characteristic that they're including in their study.
And then do you ever run into the problem of researchers saying that they feel that their work is being limited by opinions of the populations that they're researching on and may feel like they can't truly be as objective as their research seems to be?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say that because, and this is maybe a slight tangent, but one of my current projects is trying to understand how bioethics and genetics researchers think about their collaborations with each other. And I'll just say that I see the same sort of thing within our academic community itself. There is a perception of bioethics folks as slowing the pace of scientific progress. So I would say that I don't see that specifically to working with members of the public. I see that happening within academia itself.
Hi, Daphne. Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. You covered a lot of ground. I was particularly struck with the question of testing the genetics of intelligence or achievement. And just thinking in education about like the growth mindset and that concept of sort of what's fixed and what is changeable. And genetics research feels more fixed. My question for you is there any benefit to studying the genetics of intelligence? Because I'm having trouble coming up with any reasons in my own mind. And second of all, who's funding this? Is this the NIH, or what sources are funding this, and how do we influence those groups?
Yeah, so I'll first speak to the easy question: who's funding research? This work is funded partially by National Institutes of Health, in particular the National Institutes on Aging, because a lot of research link their work on cognitivity to downstream cognitive decline, things like Alzheimer's. So that's one reason why National Institutes on Aging has been a funder of this work, but they're also funded by private or philanthropic organizations. Institutes like Russell Sage Foundation or the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation have also funded social and behavioral genomic research. In terms of your question about what are the benefits to doing genomic research on something as socially controversial as cognitive ability, I mean, the list of potential benefits that I listed earlier in the presentation, and I try and pull it up again, are the common arguments that people use for doing that kind of research. People will talk about how it can increase rigor in social sciences by serving as a control variable. The polygenic score for educational attainment was used to enhance prediction of clinical phenotype type 2 diabetes. Could impact our understanding of the effects of environment or Taylor intervention. So there are an array of arguments for why they do this research.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple questions online. So the first one you're going to have to, oops, I just lost it. You're going to have to remind people what phrenology is. And the reason is I'm a nephrologist, and I once had a family that was confused between phrenology and nephrology. So we'll let you first define that. And then the question is, why shouldn't we regard this body of social genomics research as any less pseudoscience than phrenology?
Great question. So phrenology is the study of cranial capacity. So people would measure skull size of individuals who identified with different racial groups and use differences that they were measuring in skull size to make claims about differences in behaviors. So that's phrenology. And in terms of the second question, I mean, again, I think that the point that I made to the first question today about, when people ask me, does looking at the ethical, legal, social implications of social and behavioral genomics give too much credence to this field? Again, my response is, as I gave in the mini historical lesson, this work, claims regarding genetic differences in human behavior are longstanding. They're a pervasive feature of our society. I think we've been unproductive in our efforts to simply say that this is done or this is pseudoscience and kind of walk away from it. I think we need to fight the fire more directly. And so that's what my response would be to that question.
Okay, and then I think we have time for one more. And I'm going to throw out one piece of an answer to this one, if I may. Also, any thoughts on the popularity of access to preprint journal articles being used to justify various things? For example, during the pandemic, taking small, weak studies to argue for using such ineffective treatments. So there was actually an article in JAMA about 2 years ago where they went through all the preprints and they came up with like 18 different factors that any quality journal should have, like they're blinding and sort of certain study elements, and said that all the journals, and showed how few of the preprints addressed those. But then they said that every preprint should have right on the PDF when you download it a statement saying this has not been subject to peer review. And they looked at all the preprints that were out there and hardly any of them were doing it, but now the big ones are. So if anybody goes to download those papers, it says in pretty large, tight, bold on the PDF right up front, has not been subject to peer review. So there is a little bit of an effort, I think, to be more rigorous about some of this. But back to the question then, on the popularity of access to preprint journal articles being used to justify various things.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging because I think often when people think of fields like bioethics, they assume that we will have clear-cut, straight answers, and we rarely have straight-cut, clear answers. And so there are benefits to these open access preprint websites. One of them being that you have a little bit of safety in having your research scooped pre-publication if you can kind of put your name to the idea out there in the world, given how long the peer review process can often take. But again, this person here is illustrating one of the risks to this preprint enterprise, which is now growing. So there are definitely always two sides to the same coin. And I acknowledge that is an issue, but I also acknowledge that there are benefits to preprints.
Okay, and the last question came in at 8:59 under the wire, so we're going to go ahead and take it. This research, social behavioral genomics, rests on the premise that genes drive or influence behavior. However, what if behaviors and beliefs drive genetic expression, which would cancel out the conclusions of the line of research?
Yeah, I'm really glad that they brought up that point. I'm currently in the process of writing a book with a colleague. It's an adversarial collaborative book, so he is a a quantitative researcher who utilizes genomic data in his social sciences work. And two of the approaches that we're taking to this book are one describing common misconceptions about genetic research writ large, but also specifically talking about the social narratives that get passed down that also have an effect on people. So I would agree with this person's point that this is a very important observation and one that we often neglect to consider. And I think Ruha Benjamin's work talking about structural gaslighting or the datafication of justice also speaks to that, as it is the efforts that we put towards pathologizing inequality or trauma can often distract from some of the social determinants of health. We're spending our time trying to focus on the exact biological.
All right, well, just please join me in thanking Daphne one more time for this wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
And welcome to the Department of Pediatrics.
Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.